Welcome, I am 𝐸𝐸𝐸 and your host for Keep Traveling Your African Vacation, the only podcast which brings you insightful information in the African tourism industry by real tourism professionals. Today we have another great episode to bring you, and I have the pleasure of introducing Vivian McCarthy, who is the director at Acacia Africa. Vivian, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ray. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, first of all, let's just touch on the name quickly, because Acacia Africa, you've traveled a lot of Africa. You must have maybe spent a few nights under some beautiful acacias, right?
Indeed. I think that goes without saying. I've been involved with Africa for a bit over 30 years now. Acacia's been running for coming up to 30 years, and we only do Africa. I'm not from Africa originally, but I spent 2 or 3 years on the continent, tour leading and traveling around and falling in love with the place.
Tell me, Vivian, what's hooked you into Africa?
Well, I first went there when I was in my late 20s, early 30s, and as a passenger, as a client on a tour, which in those days was very popular, that started in the UK and finished in Johannesburg, and that took 5 or 6 months. I was a client in a truck, and at the end of it, I spent time in South Africa, traveling around on buses and not hitchhiking, but certainly traveling independently. When I came back to the UK and got a job back, which was in travel, I found that I was doing a promotion evening, and we had a guest speaker, and the guest speaker was an African tour operator. I looked at the transparencies being shown, and I just realized I just had to get back there, and somehow. And lucky for me, we're talking about the mid-late 80s, there were a lot of companies in the UK expanding, and I was lucky enough to be able to get a job. And before I knew it, I was running a trip or helping to run a trip, coming south again on much the same route that I'd done as a client, 1987, 8. And so I've been involved with Africa ever since.
So Acacia Africa is an overlander kind of tour operation, taking people across the African continent, right?
That's how we started in the early 90s. Things have developed and evolved quite a long way since those days. In those days, it was a big part of the market. People wanted to do long, I would say extended expeditions through the continent and finish usually in South Africa or Zimbabwe. But those days have moved on, really. The whole industry, I think, has evolved to people who tend to focus on East and Southern Africa, realizing that much of the top game parks, great scenery, can be had down there, and you don't have to spend months and months and months. You can spend anything from a few days to 7 or 8 weeks, perhaps, or longer, and have a wonderful experience and see a complete range of game parks and scenery and wildlife.
So you were born and bred in New Zealand, you're living in the UK if I'm not mistaken, yet you seem to want to spend most of your time in Africa. So my question to you is, why don't you?
Oh, well, yes, good question. I did spend 2 or 3 years in my younger day as a tour leader on the longer extended trips. And then I came back to the UK in the early 90s and I fell in love. And I got involved in the administration and in sort of the management and running the tour from a business point of view. I personally found that as much as I loved Africa, I was now working in the UK on an admin management side and taking as many trips to Africa as I possibly could within the bounds of what was practical in running the company.
Vivian, tell me, having traveled the African continent, in your mind, do you think people in the Northern Hemisphere, and I'm talking the first world, the Americas, the Europes, perhaps parts of Asia, there's an uncomfortableness on the safety aspect, not only on the political side, but on the wildlife side?
Well, it is a question sometimes. Oh, do we have animals walking through the camp at night? Well, in some places you would if you're camping in the Serengeti, in some of the campsites, but it's not very common. And I say to people, look, the biggest problem in Africa for safety of that sort is usually a mosquito or sometimes ants. If you have ants coming through your camping area, they can be a real nuisance. And I've been on a camp where we moved the whole camp overnight because we had this column of ants come through, and it was better to move.
It's amazing the little things in big quantities, how they can affect you. Vivian, for somebody that's never traveled to Africa, what would be your message to them?
Do it. I mean, Africa changed my life. It doesn't have to change everybody's lives that you spend the next 30, 40 years working in it or with it. But it's just got something about the continent. There's something in the air that just is almost like magic. And I don't mean to sound like a salesman here, but I do think that there's something different about Africa. It's a place where most of the attractions and things to see are outside of the built-up cities. Unlike some other continents where perhaps a local bus will take you to this place or that place and then you look around the city and see what's there. In Africa, it's not quite like that. As I say, most of the highlights are in more remote areas where you need a bit of organisation to visit. But I would say go because you'll want to come back. That's the thing I would say. Actually seeing elephants in the wild is very, very different to seeing them on YouTube. I think that's fundamental to experiential travel. And I'm not taking away from other continents. Asia or South America are wonderful as well. But there's something about Africa that just won't let go. And the sooner you see it, the better. Many of our visitors, of our clients, are first-time visitors to Africa. And we get a number of repeats because, as you will know, Southern Africa is very different to East Africa. There's a number of different cultures and sceneries between Kenya, for instance, and South Africa. Someone who's never been there before may start with the idea that it's one destination.
I want to touch on that, but before I get there, you mentioned elephants on YouTube, and I think what people will first hit them is how big they are, but more importantly is how quiet they are. 5-7 ton creatures, and yet they can walk past you without you even knowing, right?
They're amazing animals. They simply pad along, and I think it's just that reality of closeness and proximity that you realize that it's 10 meters away, 20 meters away. An elephant is an awesome thing to see. And not just elephants, but I don't know anyone who doesn't love elephants. We all have our favorites, but elephants, I think, are universal.
We touched on it just now, but I want to go into it a little bit deeper about the differences in Africa and the differences in the people. The Kenyans versus the Ugandans versus the Malawians versus the Mozambicans, etc. A lot of people that haven't traveled to Africa would group all these people under one umbrella. But I want you to give me your perception of all these different African cultures that you've come into contact with. And I say cultures as opposed to countries because I think it's more about different cultures than about different countries.
Absolutely. We all know, we don't have to go over it, and borders are very much a structure of the colonial times. Without going into all of that, most countries have a number of different cultures within their borders. If you think about it, Europe isn't much different. If you had never been to Europe, you might think, well, all Europeans are the same. Anyone who's been to Europe knows that's clearly not true. Here in Africa, you've got perhaps not quite the same concentration of population everywhere, but a much larger area and a huge, huge variety of peoples. What surprised me when I first went there, I think, was realizing at some point that almost everybody I met could speak 2, 3, 4 languages, English being third or fourth very often. Knowing how hard it is to try and learn another language, you suddenly realize that everybody here leaves me for dead when it comes to that sort of thing. And I think that was something that struck me personally, that it's very different down there in Africa, and you can't put everyone in the same basket.
Sure. What would your favorite parts of Africa be?
That's a very difficult question. I could maybe do a short list of 4 or 5. It's often the first time you go there it creates the biggest impression, lasting impression. I loved the desert when I first went to Africa, the Sahara. Victoria Falls was a huge impression on me when I first saw it. I'm certainly not alone there. So in Malawi, at the top end of northern Malawi, is a place called Nika, the Nika Plateau, where it's about 3,000 meters, 10,000 feet, and it is cold up there in the night time, but absolutely stunningly clear and beautiful. And that was another place that I've always thought back to as being a place I remember.
Indeed, although you bring up the normals, as in Victoria Falls and the Sahara Desert, you also mentioned there's some pretty unique places all away from the normal touristy destinations, right?
Oh, yes. And this is the thing with Africa. You come to Africa thinking, oh, I want to see Victoria Falls, or we want to see the Big Five. When they come to Africa and they see the Big Five, or 4 of the Big Five, or however many they see, they realize, well, you know, there's an enormous array of bird life that we didn't really think about. When they go to the 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸, they realize, oh, well, actually, there's this place called the 𝐦𝐸𝐿𝐸𝐸, which they might have heard of, but perhaps hadn't really pictured, which is also stunning. And of course, these are not zoos. These are huge areas.
Tell me, Vivian, in your mind, are we doing enough as a continent to conserve and make sure that the future generations will be able to enjoy not just the animals, but the pristine bushlands and woodlands and lakes, etc.?
Well, I think it's crucial that the local people have to benefit and they have to see the benefit. That has to be crucial, because if they're not benefiting, if they're not seeing that their lives are being improved, then there's something fundamentally wrong. We're seeing it a little bit in Europe, where in some countries in Southern Europe, there's an objection to tourism because it's too much. I think Africa is a long way from that because it's fortunately not a mass market destination. So it's not being over-touristed. The example that comes to mind is the Masai Mara, where it's administered by the local Masai, or at least partially administered by the local Masai people. And it's crucial that they benefit by the tourism going to the Masai Mara National Park in Kenya. And I think other countries could learn from that, and they probably have. But you need to have local buy-in, because it wasn't for tourism how much wildlife there would be remaining. Because tourism does bring a lot of hard currency into the continent, and some of it, at least, hopefully, goes to the upkeep and the maintenance of the reserves where the wildlife is.
Yeah, listen, I couldn't agree with you more. I think education of the younger generation, the local younger generation, making sure that they understand the benefits of tourism, the benefits of conservation, and what that will bring for them as far as education and further bettering their way of life as well.
I think it does for many of them. And employment, apart from anything else, it's a big employer throughout Africa, it's Southern and Eastern Africa, and that's largely for young people and also for women, and that's I think crucial. But the preservation of the nature of the wildlife is of prime importance there, because if you ask someone who's coming to Africa for the first time, why are you coming to Africa? It normally is because they want to see the animals. They may find later there's other things we want to see, or different animals, but that's normally what Africa has, which is unique. Other places have lovely scenery, they've got mountains, beaches and all the rest of it, and interesting cultures clearly everywhere. But Africa has that combination, which the animals are a serious part of it, which attract most people.
In your time traveling around Africa and traveling around to all the different parks and different destinations, for my listeners, I'd like you to give me something that's funny, that's really stuck in your head, and perhaps a story for the grandchildren one day, or you're already telling the story. I'm sure there's many of them, but there's got to be one or two that stick out and one or two that you're prepared to share with me.
I can think of a couple of times when my heart rate went up seriously. In 𝐸𝐴𝐵 National Park in Botswana, there's a place called the Safuti Reserve. There's a campsite there, and we were camping there, preparing a meal, and it sounded like hyenas very, very close by. And there were 2 or 3 of us who were on duty that day to prepare the meal. And that was a scary moment. We jumped back up on that vehicle super quick. A different occasion where we were in a normal campsite and there was a heavy grunt in the bushes, and it was just after dark, and we were preparing a meal at camp, and it scared the living daylights out of me and out of the 2 people I was with. And we were up in the vehicle before you could say Jack Robinson. The other thing, I suppose, but less heart racing, was not quite realizing at Victoria Falls quite how much water was involved in the air. On the Zimbabwe side, going in to see the falls and not being prepared to get absolutely drenched in the spray when you're walking across the front of the falls, which is an awesome, awesome feeling. Nothing really between you and the falling spray, except for about maybe 50 meters or so of thin air.
Vivian, thank you for sharing. Now, I know that you and Acacia in Africa have been very kind in offering a prize giveaway to a lucky listener of the podcast. Would you tell us in your own words what you're going to be giving away?
Yes, indeed. It's a 7-day camping tour. It runs between Pretoria and Livingstone, being Victoria Falls on the Zambian side, and it visits the Kruger National Park. We visit Motopos National Park in Zimbabwe, and we finish in Livingstone, Victoria Falls. It runs in either direction, so 7 days. It runs 2 weeks throughout the year, and we're happy to give away a place on that trip. Like most of our tours, the camping can be upgraded to accommodate tourist class levels if people wish. But it's a great trip, 7 days. It really needs another few days either side. If you're talking about flying from the UK or Australia, it's a very good introduction and insight into a little bit of Southern Africa. But it does include Kruger National Park, which is South Africa's best known park, I think. Motopos in Zimbabwe, which is a little jewel, not particularly widely known, but a beautiful park, and also a place where you may see the rhino, and finishing in Livingstone, Victoria Falls, which is an awesome place.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you, and I'm sure that we're going to get a number of adventurers emailing in to get into that lucky draw. So thank you very much for that. Vivian, it's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed your time and energy, and I'd like to thank you very much for coming on the show.
It's been a great pleasure, and it's a wonderful series, and thank you very much once again.
That was Vivian McCarthy from Acacia Africa. Do not forget that fantastic prize giveaway. All the entry details can be found in the show notes of this episode, or head over to www.wildsunsets.travel/podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please rate the show on Apple Podcasts or drop me an email. Tune in again next week when I will be chatting to another great African tourism professional. My name is 𝐸𝐸𝐿, and consider this. A few years from now, you will not remember how much it cost you, but you will still remember the memories you made. Keep traveling.